I'm going to start with a paradox. The Economist Intelligence Unit every year publishes a democracy index, ranking the world's democracies by a matrix of measurements. In 2022, Israel placed 29th out of 165 countries. And that's especially impressive when one considers that in 2006, Israel ranked only 47th. Many other countries have dropped while Israel has had an almost unbroken rise. Now, you might have been excused for thinking that democracy in Israel was flourishing. And you might have linked that to the boom in Israel's economy driven by foreign investment, largely in high tech. Now, that's been a barometer of world confidence in Israel's business climate and legal system. Israel's per capita GDP in 2006 was about $22,000. Since then, it's doubled. A year ago, for the first time in its history, Israel entered the top 20 club of countries by GDP per capita. So Israel, you might think, was freer, richer than ever. And Benjamin Netanyahu could take much of the credit. Since 2009, that is for nearly all of this period, the Likud governments under his leadership had ruled continuously until a brief interruption in 2021. And yet, on the edges of Israel, a counter-narrative formed. Not only had Israel not grown freer, they said, it had become unfree, run by a self-selecting cohort of judges. The courts, not the elected representatives, ran the country in a judicial dictatorship. And they did so for the benefit of privileged elites. Common people voted right, but they kept getting left. The man who reputedly engineered this revolution was one Aaron Barak, former head of the Supreme Court, who retired back in 2006, but whose minions have carried on his work to this day. Now, I say on the edges, and let me be specific. The Likud and its leader had almost nothing to do with it. They were busy claiming the miracle of today's Israel as their success story. And Netanyahu openly described himself as a champion of judicial independence. It was two other elements further out, which spun and retailed the dictatorship narrative. They were the religious Zionists and the ultra-Orthodox. Now, why the religious Zionists? Here, I think it's important to go back to basics. The flagship project of religious Zionism is the incorporation of all of Eretz Israel into the state of Israel. And while Israel has moved forward in so many areas, that flagship project is stuck. In 2005, it suffered a painful blow with the removal of the Israeli settlements from Gush Katif in Gaza. Religious Zionism has been grieving and aggrieved ever since. True, the number of settlers in Judea and Samaria has almost doubled since then. But in absolute terms, the Palestinian population grows by about the same number. Palestinian Authority is still there, and it's a potential nucleus of a Palestinian state, whoever still believes in it. So this status quo is anathema. How could it be broken? Bezalel Smotrich, who is religious Zionist leader and now Minister of Finance, has given us the answer in what he calls the One Hope Plan. You can look it up in the online journal Hashiloch. There's an English translation. Its aim, and I quote, is not leaving an Arab collective with national ambitions in place in Judea and Samaria. That is, eliminating the Palestinian Authority. In parallel, Israel should, and I quote, encourage part of the Arab population to emigrate to other countries. How? Again, I quote, we need to help it happen. We have not expounded on the matter here, but our new plan needs to be accompanied with a variety of measures to improve the demographic balance. And thanks to such measures, some Arabs will leave. As for Arabs who remain, again, I quote, we need to explain to the world the option of democratic rights without the right of vote for the Knesset. Now, of course, the main obstacle to all this is the notion of equality under the law, which is the basis of every Western judicial system. Upholding that as the core function of judicial review pretty much wherever it exists. And that's the real reason that religious Zionists have been the spearhead of the campaign against the courts. That's how it began, and that fuels it, I think, with passion. Now, in fact, the courts have never been an obstacle to Jewish settlement, and in most ways they facilitated it. I think in that they reflect the view of a broad Israeli consensus that sees a purpose to the settlements for all sorts of reasons. But whether or not Palestinians are a people, they are people. And implementing the One Hope Plan would be so abusive of rights and so damaging to Israel's standing that it would never pass judicial review. Thus, the desire to eliminate the courts from the field. And I think the strategy was to obscure this purpose behind a lot of legalese. The Kohelet think tank, where there are many persons whom I respect, I think didn't come up with the idea of ending judicial review, but they tried to make it sound intellectually respectable by laboring over details and drawing complex analogies to judicial systems in other countries, from New Zealand to Canada. As we all know, this effort failed spectacularly. Judicial reform provoked mass protest on a truly historic scale and has put the government on the defensive around the world. Now, analyzing the mistakes of reform proponents could fill a dozen webinars, but let me point just in a couple of directions. We can go further in detail in the discussion. First, while the primary aim was eventually to curtail the rights of non-citizen Arabs, the mechanism threatened to diminish the rights of Israeli Jews, and they have really strong feelings about that. The fact that religious Zionism shares with the ultra-Orthodox a theocratic bent also made it look like a brazen effort to overturn the internal status quo that governs religion and society. Now, the ultra-Orthodox have their own reason to revile the courts because they have their own critique of equality, not just between Jew and Arab, but between men and women, yeshiva student and soldier, and more. Jewish law is to some extent predicated on hierarchies of difference, which they want validated in state law. When they threw their weight behind judicial reform and added some preposterous legislation of their own, they poked the dormant bear of secular Israel. And this Israel is still powerful, and it extends beyond party politics and even beyond class. Second, the intellectual resources behind the whole thing were thin. The proponents identified the problem, but their solutions seemed like overkill. Let me give an example. The proposed override clause, whereby the Knesset could override a Supreme Court decision by a simple 61-vote majority, which would effectively obviate the need for the court. When Simcha Rotman, the religious Zionist champion of the reform, was interviewed right after the elections, he said, and I quote him, "The plan the religious Zionist party put forward before the elections is built on the override clause. So the override clause will be introduced immediately," end of quote. Later, though, along came the head of Kohelet, who said that the override, quote, "is completely idiotic. We never wanted the override. Nobody ever thought there was going to be an override." Now, if you're putting forward a far-reaching reform, you can't build it on something some on your own side say is idiotic. And more recently, Yariv Levin, the Likud whip, has admitted that on judicial appointments, the original proposal was flawed and, quote, "could have led to a situation in which all three branches of government become one branch." Surprise. I don't think reform proponents really thought deeply about the further implications or possible unintended consequences of their proposals. Rothman said, "Each and every section of this plan is the product of years of work and preparation." But not only did they fail to anticipate reasonable objections, they weren't even talking frankly to one another, and the gaps in thought soon showed. Watching some of the proponents go up against Alan Dershowitz made one cringe. Now, whether there will be another round of legislation is anybody's guess, but if judicial reform is dead, what might come next? Now, we now hear calls for a constitution, something Israel doesn't have. Those who call for it say it should be based on the values in Israel's Declaration of Independence. And it's really amazing how the declaration has turned into an icon of the protests. You have these giant facsimiles, which have been unrolled on city halls and university buildings, and even on the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. It's been carried in demonstrations, laid out on the pavement. People come forward and affix their signatures to it. Why has the declaration played this role? Well, it is the one document that had the widest buy-in from all parties at the time it was written in the weeks before the declaration of the state. It might be said to contain the DNA of Israel, principles that can't be overwritten by a passing majority. Now, it's certainly not a constitution by any stretch. Neil certainly would agree with me on that. But as he's already indicated, it has the stuff of one, and especially these principles. Israel is a Jewish state by virtue of natural and historic right. Its citizens are equal, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. The state guarantees freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. And the state is peace-loving and faithful to the principles of the UN Charter. Now, conceivably, a Knesset could deviate from any of these, but then Israel would cease to be the state founded on May 14th, 1948. Practically speaking, the declaration, I think, has to be the point of departure of any constitution writing, because if we start from scratch, we'll get nowhere. Now that the declaration is front and center, it's going to be misconstrued by all sides. I see that beginning already. If we have the time later, I'll give you a couple of instances of how. But let me conclude on this note. Israel has been on the right road for a long time now. We've created something remarkable, which is the envy of much of the world. We must be careful not to succumb to fringe narratives of grievance. The conservative approach is to tread carefully, deliberately, and slowly. And the point of departure must be the principles inscribed on the scroll of independence by Israel's founders 75 years ago, because there is no other Israeli alternative.